Join me on my travels as I explore extraordinary places and reveal bizarre tales and characters from our rich history. In this programme, the Victorian solution to a bit of a stink in Richmond, how the criminal twins with the perfect alibi were finally brought to justice, and what really happened at the Hallsville School disaster in September 1940. This is London Bridge, and it's definitely not falling down. But in the early 1800s, the London Bridge that stood here was, literally. So before it finally fell down, it was taken down and replaced with a new bridge in 1832. And that, as they say, was the start of the problem. The structure of the old London Bridge with its numerous piers meant it was successful at holding back the tides in the river. When it was gone, everything changed. Just over there at Richmond in Surrey, 14 miles upriver from London Bridge, things became very different. Suddenly high tides were getting higher and low tides were getting lower. And the low water levels were so incredibly low there that local residents were faced not with a mighty and world-famous river to enjoy, but at certain times of the day, little more than a pitiful puddle. The problem was so bad that in May 1848, the water here at Richmond was in striking contrast to how the river appears today. During an exceptionally low tide, it was a paltry 10 feet wide and just 3 foot 6 inches deep. There were acres of dry riverbank all along here, and it stayed like that for hours at a time. And that brings us to another rather more distressing part of the problem, well, for the local residents at least, the smell. When the tide was out, any sewage being washed up to rather posh Richmond from, how shall we put this, more unsalubrious parts of the capital was hanging around and stinking the place out. Grand local residents from their equally grand homes, perhaps unsurprisingly, decided to create a stink of their own. In the mid-1800s, raw sewage was still flowing directly into the Thames, and so what ended up in Richmond was not particularly savoury. Locals campaigned and petitioned to get something done about London's most unpleasant waste washing up on their genteel shores. And this was the solution. On the face of it, little more than a rather elegant footbridge across the Thames. But in fact, it conceals a brilliant piece of Victorian engineering. Cleverly hidden away in the footbridge and produced at the touch of a button nowadays is, to all effects, a Thames barrier. It's the Richmond Weir, and the gates control the flow of the river, to hold water above the bridge as the tide flows out, ensuring deep water at all times for the residents of Richmond and beyond. Richmond Weir and the management and conservation of the river here, all the way down to the Thames estuary, is in the hands of the Port of London Authority.
From the 18th century onwards, as London built up as a national port, there was a huge amount of barge traffic that carried goods from London, from the docks in London, right up into the centre of the country, up as far as Oxford. And so the lack of water at anything other than high tide would have interfered with their navigation.
And presumably the sewage would have been a terrible problem.
Well,
too.
yes. Despite all the great works that were done by Bazalgette in London, which cleared London's waste out of the way, the old sewers from these outlying towns tended to end up in the river, and that would have added to the unpleasantness.
What would the smell have been like?
Oh, I would imagine pretty horrible.
So the creation of this weir has actually completely transformed the landscape.
It has, yes.
And this is the landscape we have as a result.
Indeed, yes.
And this water level remains about the same.
That's right, yes. We have to impound the water level at Richmond such that navigation is kept open, and also that the riverbanks are kept covered.
So here at Richmond, is there virtually no tidal flow then?
The Loch and Weir is a half-tide facility, so it maintains the level at least at half-tide level. So beyond half-tide to full tide, we see an increase in the level, and then of course it falls away again until we get to half-tide again. That's a period about 4 hours every tide.
So upstream of the Weir, where we are here now, not only is it a much more pleasant environment, but presumably much safer for boating.
Well, yes. After the building of the Loch and Weir, this area became hugely popular as a recreational boating location. And the landing stage at Richmond became very busy, and a lot of the boathouses that we have seen operated pleasure launches and rowing boats and skiffs for people to come and have a nice day out on the river.
So at the turn of the 20th century, this would have been full of boats?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Nowadays, the river flow is carefully computer monitored to enable water levels to be fine-tuned throughout the day. But as the highly detailed drawings of the original design show, the workings are still pretty much as the Victorian engineers intended. Preserved here are also the original mathematical equations. They proved that by ingenuity, in the days before electric motors, each 32-ton gate could be raised or lowered by one man turning one handle.
Is there anything like this, or was there anything like this anywhere else in the country?
Not at that time, no. This was the first of these big mechanical weirs. There were smaller mechanical weirs, of course, but in the canal system and also on navigable rivers, but nothing of this scale.
It's very cleverly disguised, isn't it? You'd have no idea there was a weir here. Was that part of the idea?
Absolutely. When the Thames Conservators got involved with the programme, they put an extra £20,000 in to design and build all the lovely balustrading and the architectural designs that you see of the footbridge today.
It's a beautiful structure to look at, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's a lovely combination of engineering and architecture working together to produce this lovely structure.
What started out as a response to a bit of a stink actually created one of the most beautiful parts of our capital's river. Without Richmond Weir, the river landscape here simply wouldn't exist. In 1857, two twin boys were born, so alike that it was said that even their parents struggled to tell them apart. When they grew up, they were to have an extraordinary career and a highly unusual role in a scientific breakthrough. Ebenezer Albert and Albert Ebenezer Fox were the sons of a local preacher in Stevenage, but it seems they turned out to be anything but God-fearing. Their father apparently was very strict with them. Perhaps that strictness led them to rebel and turn to a life of crime. The twins became two of the most notorious and prolific poachers in the country. They used to work here in what is now Fairlands Valley Park. While they didn't exactly escape the attention of the local constabulary, they based their entire careers on their version of living off the land. Someone else's land, that is. They were so cunning they got away with poaching the lands of the local gentry for almost their entire lives. And their legendary cunning produced some very strange methods to catch the game. One of their favourite techniques was used to poach pheasants. What the twins did was this. They'd set down a series of lit candles in empty jam jars. The flickering candlelight would then attract the inquisitive birds. The twins would then pounce and kill the poor blighters with their bare hands. Tucked away in the back of the local museum is a small case of Twin Fox's mementos, including their matched pair of shotguns. But it wasn't just their poaching methods that made them so notorious. It was what happened whenever they got caught. What would happen then when they were picked up by the police?
They'd use each other as an alibi. So if one was caught, he'd say he was the other one, and whatever the other one was doing, they'd have a witness. One would be committing the crime, the other one would be in a location with another person creating an alibi, and they'd work as a team. So
Because as young men, they did actually look very alike, didn't they?
Yes, they were. They were two peas in a pod, so...
So you can understand the police getting slightly confused.
Yes, it must have been a nightmare.
And to further confuse, one of their tricks was to swap their distinctive scarves. Their father had made them each wear a different scarf as boys, because he couldn't tell them apart either. They apparently took great delight in the confusion and in undermining the authorities. They loved sort of cocking a snoot, didn't they, at the establishment?
Yes, they did. So there's one instant where they were fined £1 by the magistrate, and they paid the fine off by selling pheasants that they'd stolen from his land. So
how cheeky
a
is
bit
that?
cheeky, really.
They became sort of legends locally, didn't they?
I think, yes, they were held in a certain amount of affection, especially as they got older and they became sort of, local characters.
And was it just poaching offences, which we consider quite sort of minor offences, don't we?
For one of them, yes, it seems so, but Ebenezer had a darker side, really. He was arrested for drunkenness and rape early on, so he wasn't an attractive character, and then later he panicked when he was caught by a gamekeeper and attacked the gamekeeper.
But their notoriety brought them to the attention of a man who was about to make their apparently foolproof alibi of mistaken identity worthless. Ebenezer Albert and Albert Ebenezer Fox were the sons of the local preacher in Stevenage, but they turned to a life of crime. They became notorious poachers. But their foolproof alibi of pretending to be each other, no one could tell them apart, was about to be undone. Their notoriety brought them to the attention of a man who was about to use science to ruin their alibi of mistaken identity. He was Edward Henry, the head of the Metropolitan Police and the man who helped give the world fingerprinting. In 1901, he was trying to prove to his fellow officers at Scotland Yard that fingerprinting could be successful in the fight against crime. At the time, detectives in Europe used the French system of measuring fingers and skeletal characteristics. But being twins, the Foxes' measurements were almost identical. But their fingerprints, of course, weren't. Henry used the Fox twins to demonstrate to his fellow officers that fingerprints should be the preferred method of identification for the police.
At the end of their criminal career, really, it sort of scuppered them, and the police must have been thrilled to have fingerprinting come in because it was the perfect way to catch them. Because before that, they'd always used each other as alibis, and the police couldn't break those alibis, so it must have been very frustrating. So to have a scientific process that enabled them to fingerprint the brothers and then prove that which brother was there must have been an absolute boon for the police.
And the bizarre fame of the twins has far outlived them. This is the first ever pub to be built in Stevenage New Town. It went up in the early 1950s, and the locals decided it should be named after the area's most famous former residents. And as the current publican Jay explains, the Foxes, far from being local petty criminals, now have the whiff of heroic legend about them.
One of the things that they used to do is obviously they used to go shooting quite a lot. They were very good marksmen, the pair of them, and they would often go out shooting, and what they didn't want for themselves they'd give to people that were less fortunate themselves. So they were a bit like a sort of like a Stevenage version of Robin Hood.
Well, Ebenezer Albert died in 1926, and Albert Ebenezer followed him 11 years later. They were penniless. And their similarity continued even after death. Both were buried in unmarked paupers' graves in the same local churchyard. And neither, of course, lived to see that much of the land they poached on was built over by the new town of Stevenage. This is Hallsville School Canning Town in East London. In the autumn of 1940, this area, in the heart of the Docklands, was a prime target for enemy bombers. The school was rebuilt a few years after the war, because on September the 10th, 1940, it was bombed. It was catastrophic for the local community. But ever since, exactly what happened here has never really been clear. Some believe there was an official cover-up, others that it was just chaos.
Some say this could have been the site of London's worst single civilian disaster of the entire war.
In September 1940, the school was being used as a rest centre, a place where people whose homes had been bombed were sent while the authorities tried to find them a place to stay.
We know that the streets around the school were extremely busy. There was a long procession of families, many women and children, all carrying possessions from their bombed-out homes, coming to take shelter here in Hallsville School. The building was soon packed.
By early evening, some estimates say there were more than 1,000 people being housed here.
Then the unthinkable happened. In the early hours of that September morning in 1940, enemy bombers hit the school.
Vic Turner was a child during the Blitz. He used to live just opposite the school, and along with his family, he was in a nearby air raid shelter when the bombers flew into this part of the East End.
The house I lived in was one big heap of rubble. You know, the school was damaged, you know, beyond description really. There were people running all over the place. There was the ARP wardens trying to restore some order and get some semblance of order out of the chaos that was going on. There was ambulances flying about trying to get hold of the injured people and whatever. So all in all, it was one big sort of chaotic mess.
Now the school was already unusually full of people, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was full of people, but of course the bombing that went on the other side of that school, the people who were bombed out then was taken into the school, and of course when the school got bombed, they was already in. They already been bombed out once in their houses. They get it again in the school, don't they? You know.
The school was full of people who'd been moved away because of their own houses had been bombed.
Yeah.
What a terrible experience.
Yeah. So they got it twice, like, you know.
Near to where I met Vic in the playground is a plaque. It marks a visit by the Queen Mother to commemorate those who lost their lives here. Officially, 73. The story of what happened that night is also retold in the records held at the local Studies Library. Their accounts of survivors of the disaster and also the civilian air raid precaution wardens, the ARPs, who helped rescue people at the school, make interesting reading, and many dispute the official record.
This is Thomas Tapfield's account. He was a child at the time of the bombing and was told to wait at the school until the evacuation buses came to take everyone away. But they never arrived. It's believed they were sent to the wrong location for the pickup.
Had those buses arrived in time, probably far fewer would have died. But as Thomas recounts, no one really knew how many people were in the school. No one was keeping count.
He remembers seeing whole families he knew killed.
Thomas said that people at the time believed the number of dead was as many as 700.
This is the account of Bert Wasmuth. It's from an interview taken many years after the bombing, but clearly he remembers every moment well.
Bert was the second person to arrive on the scene immediately after the bombing. The scale of the destruction had such an effect on him that he applied to join an RAF ground crew so he could load bombs which could be dropped on the enemy. He didn't get in, though. He may have been too important to the war effort as an experienced ARP warden. Another report from an eyewitness here says there were private cars taking away the bodies of the dead. That could have hampered an accurate death toll. Some believe that many of the dead were left where they were and the area built over.
And this note is interesting. It's actually from a war cabinet memo a few days after the raid. This states that they thought the real figure killed was certainly over 200, with many more severely injured.
This memorial is in the East London Cemetery. Many of the bodies of those killed were brought here to a mass grave and buried along with other victims of the Blitz. The touching inscriptions show that whole families were wiped out. A ceremony held for them in 1941 was attended by many fellow East Enders. Andrew Linney is an A&E nurse who is training in disaster relief. It's people like Andrew who we all rely on for help in present-day major emergencies. He recently studied the Hallsville School disaster.
I found during the course of my studies that there was a lot of argument from the official and the locals' viewpoints in terms of how many casualties actually did die as a result of the bombing. A lot of evidence from even the War Office secret resume, now made public, showed that they felt that 200 casualties were reported. The ARP thought 300. Local witnesses thought 400, 450. So there's a lot of discrepancy in the amount of casualties resulting from the bomb.
Andrew also has a possible explanation for those cars apparently turning up to take away the dead, at a time when very few locals would have owned one.
I thought it was interesting at the time that there are so many local cars that turned up to move people. Where did the cars come from? How many local people would have cars and be able to move people away?
So what's your explanation for that?
Well, if there's a conspiracy theory, maybe the government would have had the ability to be able to produce loads of cars and people to drive people away, and it might have. And who knows where the bodies went to once they were moved off the scene. They could have gone to other places than the local mortuaries.
At that stage in the war, were the government censoring bad news?
Churchill had begun officially censoring from July.
So do you think it's possible there was an official cover-up?
All the evidence appears to show that a lot of people were in the building. The building was completely flattened by the bomb or bombs that hit it. It happened at 3:45 in the morning. The evidence overwhelming. I would think that there probably were more casualties than have been reported. I think there is a possibility that the government decided to dumb down the figures, if you like, to reduce the figures that maybe were there from the evidence I've seen, yes.
Just 3 months before the destruction of the school, the British Army had been evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. The government was preparing the nation for mass bombing and invasion. Did they decide that a major catastrophe in a small East London school would have been too much for everyone to bear?
They couldn't have made it 10 because everybody on the ground would have said that was rubbish, but they probably came up with a figure they felt that people would swallow, if you like. But there's no absolute evidence. I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that I would suggest is worthy of further investigation.
When I visited the school, work had almost finished on a new memorial garden to commemorate the dead, whatever their true number. It's an opportunity to remind the next generation of East Londoners what previous generations went through.